Hello everyone, this is Demet Özer, and today I will present our study on how informativeness of gestures in speech context guides visual attention during comprehension of spatial language. And in this project, I work together with Dilay, Karadöller, İrem, Türkmen, Aslı, Özyürek, and Tilbe, Göksun. So many studies show that listeners are sensitive to speakers' gestures, and observing gestures facilitate listeners' comprehension, especially when communicating about spatial information. Yet, how listeners visually process and allocate visual attention to gestures is less understood, and studies up to date show that listeners spend most of the time, like approximately 90–95% of the time, looking at the speaker's face and did not gaze to gestures much, as they can be processed peripherally. However, overt visual attention to gestures might increase under several circumstances. For example, several gesture kinematics might modulate how much listeners gaze to gestures. And also, informativeness or the communicative value of gestures might modulate how much listeners allocate direct visual attention to gestures. So one example is the intelligibility of speech or the comprehensibility of the speech. For example, in a very recent study, Drivers and her colleagues showed that non-native listeners looked at gestures more compared to native listeners, suggesting that non-native listeners might rely more strongly on gestures as the accompanying speech is somewhat less comprehensible for them compared to the native listeners. And also, another factor might be the redundancy or the non-redundancy between speech and gesture. In many cases, gestures express non-redundant information over and above the one contained in the accompanying speech. For example, in the case of the verbal pointers, such as when we say, she went that way, or when we say, for example, here, we generally use gestures to complement our speech. And in such situations, the speech is underinformative and the gestures carry the critical complementary information for the successful comprehension of the message. And in the current study, we asked whether and how informativeness of gestures modulates listeners' overt visual attention to gestures. And more specifically, our research question was, do listeners gaze at gestures more when gestures express complementary compared to redundant information in relation to the accompanying speech? So in the present study, the context was spatial, and we tested the comprehension of relative spatial relations between objects. For example, in this picture, there's a ground object, which is a vase, and there's a figure object, which is a candle, and the candle is on the right of the vase. So in the current study, we measured listeners' comprehension of such spatial descriptions under 3 different conditions. First, when the spatial relation is expressed only in speech, unimodally. Second, when it's expressed both in speech and in gesture concurrently in a bimodal fashion. And in this condition, the gesture expresses a redundant information that's already expressed in the accompanying speech. And third, when this relation is expressed only in gesture. So in this condition, there is speech, yet speech includes an adverbial demonstrative, which is here. So speech is underinformative and the gesture carries the critical complementary information. So for predictions, first, in line with earlier studies, we predicted that listeners' comprehension will be better when they see gestures compared to when they don't see gestures. And we predicted that listeners' comprehension will be the worst in the complementary gesture condition. And second, we predicted that listeners will gaze to gestures more when gestures express complementary compared to redundant information. So for this study, we recruited data from 59 native Turkish-speaking adults, and we recorded video stimuli in which an actress was describing different spatial relations between 2 objects in speech and sometimes in gesture. And there were 2 different types of spatial relations. So the spatial relations described in the videos were either viewpoint-dependent spatial relations, which were actually left and right, or the viewpoint-independent spatial relations that are on and under. And for filler trials, we use the spatial relation of in. And for speech, there were 2 sentences. In the first sentence, the actress always introduced the ground and the figure object by saying such as there is a vase and a candle. And the second sentence always expressed the relative spatial position of the figure object. So in the second sentence, the actress either uttered the specific spatial term by saying such as the candle is on the right, or uttered the non-specific spatial term, which is the adverbial demonstrative of here, by saying such as the candle is here. Of course, all videos were in Turkish. So this is an example of a single trial. After seeing the video, we presented our participants with a response screen in which they were asked to choose the picture that best depicts the described spatial relationship in the preceding video as fast and accurately as possible among 4 alternatives. And in the response screen, all pictures depicted the same ground and figure objects. The ground object was always at the center of the picture, and the figure object's position relative to the ground object changed. And during the task, we monitored participants' eye movements, and also we created 2 different areas of interest, the face and the gestural space areas of interest. And for all analyses, we used multi-level mixed effects models. First, we asked how did task performance, accuracy and reaction times change across conditions and spatial relation types. First, let's look at accuracy. For accuracy, we found a main effect of the condition. So the accuracy was lower in the complementary gesture condition compared to the redundant gesture and speech-only conditions. However, there was no difference between speech-only and redundant gesture conditions. Also, we found the main effect of the spatial relation type. So across all conditions, accuracy was lower for on-under trials compared to left-right trials. And for RT, we only found a main effect of the spatial relation type. Across all conditions, participants were slower to respond to on-under trials compared to left-right trials. And second, and more importantly for our main research question, we asked how did gazing at gestures differ across conditions and spatial relation types. And in line with our prediction, we found that when we analyzed the whole video, when we analyzed overall video, we found that participants looked at gestures more in the complementary gesture condition compared to the redundant gesture and speech-only conditions. There was also a significant difference between the speech-only and the redundant gesture conditions. However, then we asked whether the effect we observed globally in the overall video comes from the first or the second part of the stimuli. As you may recall, across all conditions, the first sentences were same, introducing the figure and ground objects. However, what differs across conditions happened during the second part of the video, in which gestures were made and the informativeness of gestures were indexed. So we split data and analyzed first and second sentences separately. And we found that actually there were no effects of conditions or spatial relation types in the first sentence. However, when we only analyzed the second part of the video, in which gestures were made and the informativeness of gestures were indexed, actually the effects that we observed in the whole video mainly comes from the second part. So participants looked at gestures more in the complementary gesture condition compared to the redundant gesture and the speech-only conditions. So as a conclusion, we found that listeners gazed at gestures more when they expressed complementary compared to the redundant information, and we showed that informativeness of gestures might modulate visual attention to gestures. And it's important because we found this effect with native listeners in a clear speech context, and also the present study demonstrates this effect in a special speech context in which gestures play a prominent role. But contrary to our predictions, we found that listeners did not benefit from seeing gestures. However, this might be due to the high accuracy across the tasks. So accuracy was like above 90% overall, so it might be due to a ceiling effect. And also we found that on-under gestures, the performance was worse. So it might be due to the fact that actually for on-under gestures, the actress executed those gestures in a very small gestural space with a very subtle kinematic difference. So this might have made it difficult for the participants to understand the described spatial location. So the gestural space might also be important in understanding when gestures actually might facilitate comprehension. So I would like to thank all of you for listening to me.